class businesses. A stream of ideas and innovations flow from our brilliant universities and research institutes, making the UK the second only to the US in all-time rankings for Nobel Prize winners. And we have an economic landscape that's been watched over by long-standing, well-respected institutions. And all of that will continue as we forge a new economic relationship with the EU. But, Mr. Speaker, the vision of an open, free-market, enterprising economy is under threat. And if that transpires, it will have a direct impact on our spending power. It's not under threat from the people on the other side of the channel, but from the people on the other side of the chamber. Let's be in no doubt about the biggest threat to the UK economy. The number one concern raised by businesses and international investors is not the form of our exit from the EU. The real project fear is the agenda of the party opposite. If they had their way, whole sectors of the economy...
Order, order. It really is very, very unseemly. And I'm sorry to have to say that to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who's always been unfailingly courteous in his personal dealings with me and probably with everybody else. I say what I say with a heavy heart and not without reflection. There is a procedure to statements of this kind, a very long-established procedure, and it bothers me greatly that the Right Honourable Gentleman, in the course of a statement, seems to be veering into matters out with, not even tangential, but unrelated to the spending round upon which he is focused. And I know that I say what I do with the vigorous concurrence of people who've been in this House a great deal longer than he has or than I have. And so I must ask the Chancellor, who I'm sure is fleet of foot, so to adjust his remarks from his prepared text that he focuses on that upon which he should focus and not upon that which is immaterial to the statement. And I'm setting out the position, and no one, be he ever so high, is going to tell me what the procedures in the Chamber of the House of Commons are. The Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, you'll recall that when I first took my seat as a Member of Parliament of Bromsgrove, the economy was in a very different position, and since then we've had to work hard to restore the nation's finances. And it is precisely because we have restored the nation's finances that we can have the spending commitments that I'm about to make today. And I have to, Mr. Speaker, if I may, set out the context of what the situation was then and how we've got out of that, so that we can focus on how we can generate the spending power that we are able to deploy today. And I know, Mr. Speaker, that back then our budget deficit was 10% of GDP. We borrowed £150 billion in Labour's last year in office. It was the highest deficit in our peacetime history. We were borrowing £1 in every £4 that was spent. The party opposite lost control of the nation's finances, as they always do, and it fell to Conservatives to pick up the mess. Now, Mr. Speaker, my two immediate predecessors took the difficult decisions that we need to bring the deficit under control that allows us to have the spending that I'm setting out today. They didn't do that for ideological reasons, but because running an enormous deficit meant that our debt was rising at an unsustainable rate, making our economy vulnerable to shocks and passing on a huge burden to the next generation. The deficit now, Mr. Speaker, is 1.1% of GDP. For the first time in a generation, public sector debt is falling sustainably as a share of our national income. And we've boosted our credibility around the world and built confidence in the UK economy again. Labour left behind a bankrupt Britain, and we fixed it. Now, thanks to those difficult decisions and the hard work of the British people, we can now afford to turn the page on austerity and move forward from a decade of recovery to a decade of renewal. Mr. Speaker, our careful management of the public finances means we can now afford to spend more on vital public services. So today, I'm deciding to set the real increase in day-to-day spending next year at £13.8 billion, delivering on the people's priorities across the NHS, education and police, and giving certainty to all departments about their budgets for the next year, clearing the decks for a government that is delivering Brexit. And I've always believed in the importance of living within our means. And unlike the party opposite, I won't squander the hard work of the last 9 years. So even with the extra spending, we are still meeting the current fiscal rules. But while our biggest challenge a decade ago was getting the deficit down, our biggest challenge today is getting our long-term economic growth back to where it was before Labour's Great Recession. If we can do that, Mr. Speaker, we can make sure there can be future spending increases that can also be sustainable. Boosting wages and raising living standards which have stagnated for too long, levelling up across the regions and nations. And we need to improve our productivity, the amount that's produced every hour worked. That isn't just a technical term. Slower productivity means lower wages and uneven growth across the country. If productivity had continued to grow at its pre-crisis levels, then average annual wages would be £5,000 higher. That pressure on people's pay packets speaks to a wider sense of disillusion and unfairness, especially in so many towns and cities outside London and the South East. Even as the economy has grown, the people have worked hard, and not everyone feels that they've benefited. There's a real sense of anxiety that's emerged over the years, a sense of politicians aren't listening and that the system isn't working, that the free market model isn't living up to its promise. We're seeing divisions emerge throughout society between regions and communities, rich and poor, rural and urban, young and old. And addressing those concerns will be a serious effort, and that's what will be shown in these spending plans today. So we will develop a new economic plan for the years ahead, a plan that moves beyond the last decade of economic recovery and looks forward to a decade of renewal, a plan that invests more in the future growth of this country. So, Mr. Speaker, we can afford to invest more because our economy is growing and our public finances are strong. And we are also deciding on our fiscal approach at a time when the cost of government borrowing is at record lows. Interest rates have been low for many years, and in recent weeks the cost of government borrowing has fallen below 1% across all maturities. In the years after the financial crisis, many expected interest rates to swiftly rise to pre-crisis levels, but structural factors have kept interest rates low, not just in the UK, but across the developed world, increasing our confidence that we will be able to continue to see low rates for a number of years. So it is my judgment today that with a strong fiscal position and record low cost of borrowing, we can invest more in our growing economy. That doesn't mean that we can borrow more forever and ever. The sustainability of our public finances depends on wider factors, not just the cost of borrowing. Our population, the global economy is slowing, the challenge of decarbonisation is real. So we won't be writing blank cheques, unlike the party opposite. We won't be able to afford everything, and we'll need to prioritise investment in policies that deliver real productivity gains and boost economic growth in the long term. We'll still need to make difficult choices about our national priorities, within a clear set of rules to anchor our fiscal policy and keep control of our national debt. So, Mr. Speaker, today I can announce that ahead of the budget later this year, I will review our fiscal framework to ensure it meets the economic priorities of today, not of a decade ago. Mr. Speaker, the first priority of our new economic plan will be to rebuild our national infrastructure. High-quality and reliable infrastructure is essential to how we live, we work and travel. But the truth is that across many decades, governments of all colours have underinvested in infrastructure. The quality of our infrastructure means we've fallen behind our competitors. We're the fifth largest economy in the world. It isn't good enough that we're so far behind on infrastructure. It isn't good enough that so many commuters spend their mornings staring at a delayed sign at their train platform. It isn't good enough that our small business owners waste so much time because of slow internet speeds and poor mobile communications. We're going to change that. We want faster broadband for everyone in the country, quicker mobile connections and better signal coverage, cleaner energy, greener transport and more affordable fuel bills for our homes and offices. We want more trains and buses to connect the great cities of the north. We want to build world-class schools and hospitals. We want to push the frontiers of science and technology and turbocharge our ambition on research and development. We want to build and invest in every region and every nation of this great United Kingdom. From the motor highway to the information highway, we'll settle for nothing less than an infrastructure revolution. Mr. Speaker, to keep spending under control, we will, of course, set a high bar for funding projects, and they'll have to show real value for money with credible delivery plans and budgets, starting with the government's rapid review of HS2. We'll target that investment at national priorities like regional growth and decarbonisation. And let me take this opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to thank my honourable friend, the member for Chelmsford, for her tireless work as the chair of the all-party group on infrastructure. So, yes, Mr. Speaker, we'll use the government's resources to kick-start the infrastructure revolution, but we'll also do more to give private investors the confidence to back these projects too. We want all of this to be underpinned by strong, independent institutions. We set up the National Infrastructure Commission in 2015 and will continue to rely on its expert advice as we look carefully at other institutional reforms that might be needed. So our infrastructure revolution will be strategic and carefully planned. And speaking of revolutionaries, Mr. Speaker, let's contrast that with Labour's approach. I'll invest in new infrastructure that will grow the economy, and Labour will borrow hundreds of millions to renationalise unproductive assets and then run them into the ground. Mr. Speaker, the choice for the country is clear between a wasteful, ideological opposition with outdated ideas and a government that will kick-start a decade of renewal for this country. Mr. Speaker, today we lay the foundations of a new economic plan. We're turning the page on a decade of necessary work to fix the public finances and writing a new chapter in our public services. Health and education aren't just the names of departments. They're lifelines of opportunities. They're lifelines of opportunities, just as they were for me when I was growing up. The teachers and lecturers who persuaded me to study economics in the first place.
Order. I apologise for the Chancellor having to interrupt. There will be ample opportunity for colleagues to question the Chancellor of the Exchequer, but the statement must be heard. The Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, health and education are lifelines of opportunities, just as they were for me when I was growing up. The teachers and lecturers who persuaded me to study economics in the first place. The police officers who kept us safe when the street I grew up in became a centre for drug dealers. The NHS that cared for my dad in his final days. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are the beating heart of our country, and we invest to support them today. Mr. Speaker, as I turn to the details of today's announcements... Wait, it's coming. Let me first thank the dedicated officials in the Treasury for all their hard work, delivering what I'm told is the fastest SR in history. And let me particularly thank my right honourable friend, the member for Richmond, who takes the approach to spending you would expect from an adopted Yorkshireman. He's displayed his typical mix of energy, courtesy and rigour, and let me just say there's no productivity problem in the Chief Secretary's office. Mr. Speaker, next year I will add £13.4 billion to the plans for total public spending, including £1.7 billion added to capital spending. These extra funds take the real increase in day-to-day spending to £13.8 billion, or 4.1%. That means I'm delivering the fastest increase in day-to-day spending for 15 years. That funding allows us to start a new chapter for our public services and funds the people's priorities. Our decisions today have been guided by our ambition to build a safer Britain, a healthier Britain, a better educated Britain, and a more global Britain. Mr. Speaker, my family grew up on a road in Bristol that a national newspaper described back then as Britain's most dangerous street. But to us, it was just home. After we left, my brother became a policeman and has been in the force for over 25 years. So I've seen the impact the job has on the lives of those that are courageous enough to do it. So today I pay tribute to the bravery, courage and dedication of our hard-working police officers. As Home Secretary, I saw firsthand how the demands of our police forces are changing and increasing. Yes, traditional crime is down by a third since 2010, but the threats from terrorism have escalated and evolved. The internet is changing how criminals operate and break the law, and we've seen too many horrifying stabbings on Britain's streets. So with our frontline officers reporting that they are overstretched, it's clearly time to act and do more. And today I can announce, Mr. Speaker, a 6.3% real terms increase in Home Office spending, the biggest increase in 15 years. That means £750 million to fund the first year of our plan to recruit 20,000 new police officers. With an extra £45 million this year so that recruitment can start immediately, getting the first 2,000 officers in place by the end of March. And let me thank my right honourable and honourable friends, the members for South West Bedfordshire, Wokingham, Isle of Wight, Nuneaton and Telford for championing the police and police resourcing. The threats facing our police officers are evolving too, so the way we resource them will have to evolve in 3 areas. First, serious and organised crime is the most deadly national threat faced by the UK, costing the nation at least £37 billion a year. The scale and the complexity of this threat means that we need to do more to develop our response. So I'm announcing today a formal review to identify the powers, the capabilities, governance and the funding needed ahead of a full spending review next year. Second, this year, sadly, has seen more attacks on places of worship, including mosques and synagogues. That's unacceptable in a diverse, open, tolerant society like ours. So to protect our religious and minority communities, I'm announcing today that I will double the places of worship fund next year. And I thank my honourable friends, the members for Hendon and the member for Finchley and Golders Green, for their tireless work in combating hate crime. Also today, I'm announcing £30 million of new funding to tackle the scourge of online child sexual exploitation. Mr. Speaker, a better resource police force will deliver better outcomes for the British people, and it will increase the demands on our already overstretched criminal justice system. So today, we invest more in our criminal justice system to manage that increasing demand, with a 5% real terms increase in the resource budget for the Ministry of Justice and an increase in their capital budget to £620 million next year, and an extra £80 million for the Crown Prosecution Service. Taken together, today's spending round will dramatically improve the functioning of the criminal justice system, with more prosecutors, a reformed probation system, better security in prisons, and funding to begin delivery of 10,000 new prison places. Mr. Speaker, the spending round is delivering on the people's priorities, and there is no higher priority than the NHS. Last year, we increased NHS spending by an extra £34 billion a year by 2023-24. That was the single largest cash increase in our public services for more than 70 years. Today, we reaffirm our commitment to the NHS with a £6.2 billion increase in NHS funding next year. We're investing more in training and professional development for our doctors and nurses, and over £2 billion of new capital funding starting with an upgrade of 20 hospitals this year and £250 million for groundbreaking new artificial intelligence technologies to help solve some of the healthcare's biggest challenges today, like easier cancer detection, discovering new treatments, and relieving the workload on doctors and nurses. Mr. Speaker, we can't have an effective health system without an effective social care system too. The Prime Minister has committed to a clear plan to fix social care and give every older person the dignity and security that they deserve. So I can announce today that councils will have access to new funding of £1.5 billion for social care next year, alongside the largest increase in local government spending power since 2010, and on top of the existing £2.5 billion of social care grants. That's a solid foundation to protect the stability of the system next year and a down payment on the more fundamental reforms the Prime Minister will set out in due course. But that's not the only action that I'm taking today to support vulnerable people. On any given night, there are too many people sleeping rough on our streets. The human cost is too high. Today we do more, with £54 million of new funding to reduce homelessness and rough sleeping, taking it to a total funding of £422 million next year. That's a real terms increase of 13%. And can I thank my honourable friend, the member of Harrow East, for his tireless work in fighting homelessness. Mr. Speaker, a healthy environment is a precondition for a healthy population. And that's why we've set out an ambitious 25-year plan for the UK's natural environment. And today we go further. Leaving the EU provides an opportunity to set world-leading environmental standards, and we're giving DEFRA £432 million of funding to do so. We're providing £30 million of new money to tackle the crisis in our air quality, and another £30 million for biodiversity, including the expansion of our Blue Belt programme, a vital part of our campaign to protect precious marine species like turtles, whales and seabirds. We're stepping up our leadership on climate change with new funding for BEIS to develop new programmes to help meet our net zero commitment by 2050. And we'll set out further details of our plans for decarbonisation and infrastructure in that infrastructure strategy later this year, keeping our promise to be the first government in history to leave our environment in a better condition than we found it. Now, Mr. Speaker, alongside providing for the health of our population, the most important task of a government is to educate the next generation. Education and skills are at the heart of our vision for a national renewal. The economy isn't just about GDP or PSNB. There are many broader tests that matter too. Our children, are they growing up to be better off than their parents? Do hard work and talent matter more than where you are born? A good school, inspirational teachers are the most effective engine for social mobility that there is. That's why today we are delivering on our pledge to increase school spending by £7.1 billion by 2022-23 compared to this year. Next year, we'll make sure that day-to-day funding for every school can rise at least in line with inflation and rising pupil numbers, with the schools that have been historically underfunded benefiting the most. Every secondary school will be allocated a minimum of £5,000 for every pupil next year. And every primary school will be allocated at least £3,750 per pupil, on track to reach £4,000 per pupil the following year. This funding will mean that teachers' starting salaries can rise to £30,000 by 2022-23, so that we can attract more of the best graduates into teaching. We've allocated nearly £1.5 billion per year to contribute to teachers' pensions. And we're providing over £700 million to give more support to children and young people with special educational needs, an 11% increase compared to last year. Nearly every other department I'm announcing today will be funded for just 1 year. But we recognise the importance of schools being able to plan. So we are announcing today a full 3-year resource settlement for schools, levelling up education, improving standards, and giving every young person the same opportunities in life, wherever they live in our great country. And let me particularly thank my honourable friends, the members for Bexhill, Humbattle and Cheltenham and St Albans, for championing schools. Now, Mr. Speaker, the education system is about more than just schools. For too long, further education has been a forgotten sector. Over 1 million young people continue their education beyond the age of 16 at colleges or sixth forms. And I know, because I was one of them. I went to my local FE college. If I hadn't had the teachers and the lecturers that I did, I wouldn't be standing here today as Chancellor. Further education transformed my life, and today we start transforming further education with a £400 million increase in 16-19 education funding next year. The base rate will increase to £4,188, a faster rate of growth than in core school funding. And let me congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Harlow, and my honourable friend, the member for Harborough, for their representations on further education. The government will also increase early years spending by £66 million to increase the hourly rate that's being paid at maintained nursery schools and other childcare providers who deliver on the government's free childcare offer. And I want to thank my right honourable friend, the member for Chipping Barnet, for raising this issue with me. Mr. Speaker, our young people deserve high-quality services and support even after the school day is over. So earlier this year, following a recommendation from my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford, I visited the fantastic on-site youth zone in Barking. It was a brilliant example of how much Britain's network of youth centres add to their local communities, getting young people off the streets and changing lives for the better. So today, I'm asking DCMS to develop proposals for a new youth investment fund and to set out plans to build more youth centres, refurbish existing centres and deliver high-quality services to young people across the country. Better schools, higher pay for teachers, more youth centres. That's how this government will improve social justice and create opportunity for all. But our ambitions for a truly national renewal don't stop there. We are a one-nation party, and this is a one-nation government. So, Mr. Speaker, so at the heart of our new economic plan is the need to level up across this country. Every region and nation in the United Kingdom will benefit from new funding that I'm providing today to police, to schools, to health, social care and much more. Today we confirm funding of £3.6 billion for the new Towns Fund, providing a wave of investment to our regions and places. And a better transport links across the country will be a crucial part of levelling up across the nation. We have already allocated a total of £13 billion for better transport across the north. We'll fund the Manchester to Leeds route of the Northern Powerhouse Rail, and we'll set out more details, far more details, in the autumn on our new infrastructure strategy. Now, Mr. Speaker, you may not know this, but my dad was a bus driver. Having watched him work, I know that local buses can be a lifeline for many communities. So today we put the wheels back on the Great British Bus with more than £200 million to transform bus services across the country. We're funding ultra-low emission buses and we'll trial new on-demand services to respond to passenger needs in real time. We'll set out more details of our new buses in due course once my right honourable friend the Prime Minister has finished painting models for them. Mr. Speaker, our new economic plan won't stop at the borders of England. It will be a plan for all nations of the United Kingdom. In Scotland, decisions taken in today's spending round will provide over £1.2 billion of extra funding for next year. And we are taking a further step today. Mr. Speaker, we are taking a further step today to support Scottish farmers. In 2013, when the UK government allocated the Common Agricultural Policy funding within the UK, Scottish farmers lost out. Today, we correct that decision, making available an extra £160 million for Scottish farmers, something that I know that my honourable friends on these benches from Scotland will be pleased to hear. I'd also like to take the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to thank my friend Ruth Davidson for everything she's done for that great nation. In Wales, today's spending round means an extra £600 million of funding for the Welsh Government. And in Northern Ireland, we are providing an extra £400 million from today's announcements. I welcome the case that's been made by the DUP for improved hospice care, for support for those that have been tragically wronged in the contaminated blood scandal. And those are rightly devolved matters. But I sincerely hope that the Northern Ireland administration will use some of the new funding that we're providing today to address those issues. Taken together, today's announcements will give the devolved administrations the biggest spending settlement for a decade. Mr. Speaker, throughout our history, Britain has always been at its best when we are open, global and outward-looking. Trading with the world beyond our shores has always been key to Britain's economic prosperity. And as we seize the opportunities of Brexit, we can establish new partnerships and trade relationships across the globe. For too long, we've let those trading relationships wither. And as my right honourable friend, the Trade Secretary, would be the first to acknowledge, this is a disgrace. So today, we invest in securing Britain's influence in the world. We support diplomacy with £90 million of funding for 1,000 new diplomats and overseas staff and 14 new upgraded diplomatic posts. We'll boost trade with £60 million to extend the Great Campaign for next year. And if you're in any doubt about Britain's important role on the world stage, just look at the bonanza of international festivals and events that I'm funding today. In December, we'll welcome the NATO leaders meeting. Next year, we'll host the COP26 discussions if our bid is successful, thanks to the leadership of my right honourable friend, the member for Devizes. In 2021, we'll host the G7, and in 2022, we'll host the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. Today, I can confirm the government's total commitment to this celebration of sport will be over £500 million. The Games will be a huge boost for the West Midlands, and I'd like to congratulate Andy Street for the leadership he has shown in that region. One of my personal highlights of the summer was meeting the England cricket team in the Downing Street Gardens. That World Cup winning side showed us the importance not just of talent and hard work, but of diversity too. A skipper from Ireland, a bowler from Barbados, and an all-rounder from New Zealand. As with our cricket team, so with our country, we are the most successful multi-ethnic democracy in the world. And I'm proud to live in a country where someone with my background can be Chancellor of the Exchequer. This spending round embraces modern Britain in all its diversity, and we make available today an additional £10 million to continue the Integration Areas programme that I first announced in 2018 as Community Secretary. That fund will continue to support thousands of the estimated 1 million adults in the UK who do not speak English well or at all. Openness to talent from around the world matters for our economy too. Once we've left the EU, we'll be able to create a points-based immigration system that meets the needs of the UK economy and the British people. We've already dropped arbitrary immigration targets. We've recently announced a new, highly flexible fast-track visa for scientists. And today, I'm putting funding in place to give victims of the Windrush scandal the compensation that they deserve. All part of confirming once and for all that Britain will always be open to the world's brightest and the best talent. Mr. Speaker, nowhere are our values of openness and tolerance better expressed than in international aid. The UK aid logo can be seen around the world, on health clinics, school books, emergency food supplies, and so today we protect our commitment to spending 0.7% of our national income on aid. Global Britain is about projecting our values into the world, but we know that hard power matters too. Britain already spends more on our defence and national security than any other country in Europe. We are one of only 7 countries to meet the 2% commitment to NATO. So today, we will go further still, with an additional £2.2 billion of funding for the MOD, a real terms increase of 2.6% for the budget next year, increasing again the share of our national income we spend on defence and national security. This year is the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings. We pay tribute to the sacrifices of the extraordinary generation of British soldiers who fought and died during that campaign. And today I can announce £7 million of funding for the Normandy Memorial Trust to complete their memorial overlooking Gold Beach, where so many troops came ashore. And we will also support the veterans of today's wars as well, as we confirm the funding today for the new Office of Veterans Affairs. And I congratulate my honourable and gallant friend, the member for Plymouth Moor View, on his tireless work in championing veterans. Mr. Speaker, I've set out today a big increase in public spending that will pay for more police and safer prisons, more nurses and better hospitals, more money for schools and further education. But I now turn to the remaining departments across Whitehall, those that have not been protected over the last decade. Investing in the people's priorities inevitably means difficult decisions elsewhere. Every spending review presented to this House over the last 15 years has had to find cuts from those departments. This party has never shied away from taking the difficult decisions to make sure that we live within our means. Those decisions were tough, but they have paid off. And so I can announce today that no department will be cut next year. Every single government department has had its budget for day-to-day spending increased at least in line with inflation. That's what I mean by the end of austerity, Mr. Speaker. Britain's hard work paying off. A country living within its means, able to spend more on the things that matter. Mr. Speaker, I am delivering today's spending round in unusual circumstances. Understandably, much of our attention and the attention of the country is focused on the important matters before the House later today. But we must not forget that Brexit is not all that matters to the British people. It is not the only topic at the dinner table. Today's spending round makes sure that if you fall ill, you can get the care and the support that you need. That when you drop off your child at the school gates, you can trust that they will get the best possible education. That when you walk down the street, you can feel safe and secure. And today, we move from a decade of recovery to a decade of renewal. Yes, we will keep control of the public finances, but we will invest too in the long-term growth of this country. It was just 6 weeks ago today that this new administration took office. The PM promised that we wouldn't wait until Brexit Day to deliver on the people's priorities. And today, we meet that promise. With a new chapter for our public services, a new plan for our economy, and a new beginning for this country, I commend this statement to the House.
John McDonnell. Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the Chancellor to his new job? Although after that, I'm beginning to miss the old one. I believe that the Chancellor may be the first person to hold that role whose father, like my own, was a bus driver. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to welcome him to his new job. I also hope what they say is true, that you wait ages for one son of a bus driver to become Chancellor of the Exchequer, only to be followed soon after by another. Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid that's probably the end of what the Chancellor and I have in common. Let me thank the Chancellor for abiding by the convention of providing me with a copy of his statement. It was a compendium of meaningless platitudes. So could I ask him? Could I ask him to take a message back to the person who obviously drafted the statement? So if he could tell Mr. Cummings, the man who cancels the Chancellor's own speeches, sacks his staff without telling him, and then has them and
act like a Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I believe the honourable member for Uxbridge is shouting at me. Last time he was shouting at someone, they had to call the police. So I don't think we need to go as far as that. And Mr. Cummings, who had the member of staff escorted, you might need to call the police.
Order. Calm must descend on the chamber, and people should try to operate at the level of events and in all parts of the House at the level of their important responsibilities as members of the House. John MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, the member of staff was escorted off the premises by an armed police officer. Can I just say this? This is no way to treat a member of staff. But can I ask him to tell Mr. Cummings on the spending review, do not insult the intelligence of the British people. The people will see today's statement as the grubby electioneering that it is. This is not a spending review as we know it. This is straight out of the Linton Crosby Handbook of Opinion Poll Politics. The Tories have checked what are the top 3 or 4 issues in the polls, and they've cynically judged how little money they have to throw around to try and neutralise those issues and the concerns of people. So to come here and to try and fool us with references to people's priorities is beyond irony. When did this extremist right-wing Tory group ever put the people first? Ever? Were they putting the people first when they froze child benefit year after year, or introduced universal credit, a brutal regime? The result this summer, according to the Childhood Trust, was children scavenging for food in bins because they didn't have free school meals in the summer holidays. Were they putting people first when they cut council budgets and prevented 1 million elderly and disabled people getting the social care they needed? Were they putting people first when they cut social services budgets so much that we now have record numbers of children coming into care and 155 women a day turned away from refuges? We're expected to believe that these Tories, who for years have voted for harsh, brutal austerity, have had some form of Damascene conversion. I tell you, they treat our people with contempt. Announcements have been dripped out over the last week or so, all designed to give the impression of a spending spree. Announcements dictated by Number 10, meekly accepted by a Chancellor too weak to conduct a full multi-year spending review as he should.
That's the reality.
Even before the government's majority disappeared yesterday. We've seen the so-called headroom which the Chancellor's predecessor had claimed was needed to prepare for a no-deal Brexit, spent instead on preparing for a general election. Yep. We all know the Chancellor may not be in his job very long, and maybe that's why he felt he needed to rush a spending round based on figures from March, rather than wait from the Office for Budget Responsibility to tell him officially what the rest of us have known for some time, that the economy, after 9 years of Tory austerity, is in bad shape and, yes, getting worse, stagnating. A full fiscal event would have meant new economic forecasts, the need for a fiscal framework to give departments security over the Parliament, allowing them to plan ahead after years of cuts. Instead, we get this sham of a spending review. They're claiming to be against austerity after years of voting for it. Yep. They're claiming to be using headroom, which he knows has largely disappeared. And yet they're still failing to deliver a real end to austerity. Let's take a look at some of the announcements that the Chancellor has confirmed today. For schools, the Chancellor has announced new spending of £1.8 billion next year. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has previously estimated that would cost £3.8 billion this year alone to reverse the cuts that have been made. Was the Chancellor aware, when drawing up his spending plans, that the Department of Education budget as a whole has been slashed by almost £10 billion in real terms since 2010? And so the reality is this, isn't it? That heads will still be sending out begging letters, and teachers will still be buying basic materials for their classes. And you know, they have some front to mention childcare. After the hundreds of Sure Start centres closed under their watch, undermining the start in life for our children. They mentioned that £700 million was announced for children with special needs and disabilities. Does the Chancellor know that the Local Government Association have found that councils already face a funding shortfall for SEN children of £1.2 billion by 2021? So the reality is that these children will still be left vulnerable and in need, and their futures in jeopardy. That's what it means today. And on further education colleges, they're getting a one-off £400 million amount. Does the Chancellor really think they should be grateful? Grateful for that, when he's cut £3.3 billion off them since 2010. And the reality is the economy will still continue to be desperately needed in the skills training that our economy requires, and our young people will still be denied it as a result. On the NHS, the NHS announcement of £1.8 billion spending for the NHS it's already been exposed as largely a re-announcement of existing money. And there's no mention, really, is there, of the £6 billion backlog in maintenance that need in our hospitals. Still, our hospitals using buckets to catch water coming through leaking roofs. Operating theatres closed because of the lack of maintenance over the last 9 years of austerity. And they mention GP waiting times. Any announcement on GP waiting times is likely to be turned out to be totally undeliverable. Why? Because we've just lost 600 full-time equivalents of GPs over the last year. They're just not there because of 9 years of lack of investment. And local government, any new money for local government today will be a drop in the ocean compared to what? The 60% of their funding cuts which councils have lost in recent years. What effect does the Chancellor estimate his announcement today will have on, for example, the crisis in children's services that we've highlighted at every spending review and budget of the last 2 years? There's been a 29% drop in government funding after 8 years, and vulnerable children, as a result, are left at risk. On homelessness, He's mentioned just now, the Chancellor has mentioned just now, 54 million of additional spending to tackle homelessness. There's been a 160% increase in people sleeping rough. We've had people dying near the doors of Parliament in the last 2 years. The Local Government Association says at the moment, just to get by, there's a £100 million spending gap. The most vulnerable within our society put at risk as a result of their austerity over 9 years. Yep. And he expects us to celebrate an inadequate attempt to plaster over the problems that we have. And on bus services, he mentions 200 million. He mentions allocated to bus services. This is the third of the 645 million that's been cut from bus services since 2010. And on police, they seem to forget they cut 20,000 police officers. He expects us to celebrate what he's announced today. And we now know, at best there'll be only 13,000 on the streets. And just can he tell us actually how many will be frontline? But I tell him, yes, we will support him in terms of the investment to protect religious establishments and communities, and we will support him in terms of tackling the problems that young children, protecting children from online abuse. Of course we will. But you know, the real protections comes from those safer neighbourhood teams that we constructed under Labour, that we had in every one of our wards, with a sergeant, police officers and police support officers, all of whom have been wiped out as a result of turnout. And on prisons, an honourable member has shouted out, not true. Well, he needs to go out into that community and talk about the increase in violent crime that there is within our community as a result of what's happened. On prisons, he's spoken of money to create another 10,000 prison places. Can the Chancellor just tell us, are they the same 10,000 prison places promised by previous Justice Secretaries in 2016, 2017 and yet again in 2018?
Good question.
And also, can you just answer us, how many suicides, how many assaults on staff have taken place because of their cuts to prison staff over the last 9 years? And will he or someone in the government ever apologise to the Prison Officers Association for ignoring their warnings about the effects of staff cuts on safety in our prisons? These are just some of the announcements we heard today, but there's many that we've heard very little about today. What about those that have been effectively forgotten in a Chancellor's opportunist one-year spending round? What about the real structural reform to address the social care crisis, which we've been waiting for how many years? 3, 4? All we have now is a sticking plaster of £1 billion, which will leave this sector in the same sorry state as now. What does that mean in real terms? It means 1.4 million not getting the care they need. 87 people dying a day before they get the social care to support them. I understand that the Chancellor's mates, the bankers, were pushing the other day for more tax cuts and less regulation. I suppose they think they've got a soft touch in number 10 and number 11. And I hope he sent them packing. But you know, when you compare how much has been cut from basic social services that we need and vulnerable people need for support, and then you compare that to, well, what it's calculated at, well, by the end of the next couple of years, £110 billion giving out in tax cuts to corporations. Exactly. You can see why people don't believe this government has any concept of social justice or equality.
Absolutely.
Does the Chancellor have any words either for the thousands suffering The honourable member for Uxbridge said pathetic. I'll tell you what developed real pathos. That's for many of us in our constituency surgeries are having to deal with people who are dependent on universal credit. And yet the Chancellor didn't have any words for the thousands who are suffering from the brutal rollout of universal credit, the people we represent, who now are queuing up at food banks as a result of the cuts. Traditionally, the spending review concentrates on department expenditure limits rather than social security. I appreciate that. But there's no reason why the Chancellor couldn't have signalled the government's intent, at least to end the misery and hardship that their policy is causing and to end the rollout of universal credit as it now is. I have to say, look, most shockingly of all, the Chancellor has given no sign, really, that he understands the scale of the climate emergency facing us and the urgency which a significant government response is needed. He mentions climate but allocates what is effectively minuscule amounts of funding to address what is an existential threat to our society. I hope that members will remember those who got no comfort from today's announcements in the next few weeks. If the government pushes ahead with their plans for tax cuts that mainly benefit the wealthy, that is widely rumoured. I hope members will remember all those individuals and all those services which were deemed too unimportant by the Chancellor to address today. Because, yes, I tell him, whenever that election comes, in any election campaign, you can be sure that the Labour Party will be reminding those people and the voters what 9 years of austerity have done to them. And today's failure to act, the opportunity today was to really end austerity, to start reversing austerity. Yes, to give people some hope. What a missed opportunity. And it will be, just as we remember, can you remember when, Mr. Speaker, we were told there was no alternative? There was no money? We all know the lines. We've heard them enough times. They weren't true then, and they aren't true now. The majority of economists have always agreed that there was another approach the government could have taken rather than austerity. And we always argued, and we were right, that austerity was a political choice, not an economic necessity. As recently as March, the party opposite ploughed on saying there was no alternative. So look at them now suddenly proclaiming an end to austerity. After 125,000 excess deaths as a result. After 100 billion taken out of the economy. After the worst decade for wage growth since the 19th century. Just because there may be, what? An election round the corner. Yep. And after all that, to deliver what is a pathetic sum to spending departments who are on their knees at the moment, it's just adding insult to injury. A government not just callous and uncaring, but hypocritical as well. This isn't a government, it's a racket. They're pretending to end austerity when they do nothing of the sort. They're pretending to plan ahead whilst they plot a no-deal Brexit that would devastate parts of our economy. A Chancellor and a Prime Minister, as my right honourable friend said yesterday, no mandate, no morals and no majority. They're trying to distract us from crumbling public services and stagnating wages. And they've created, after a decade in charge, it's almost they forget. They've been in government for 9 years. They seek to fool the British public with fantasy promises of a Brexit deal they knew they couldn't deliver, and they weren't even trying to negotiate. a short-lived government that will go down in history for its unique combination of right-wing extremism and bumbling incompetence. A government that betrays the people it is meant to serve. I tell you, a government that will never be forgiven, but will soon be forgotten.
Mr. Speaker, at least he didn't try to throw a little red book at me this time. So let's see. The Shadow Chancellor says he attacks the decisions that were made over the last decade to restore the nation's finances. He attacks the free enterprise system, the same free enterprise system that has delivered the prosperity that our nation enjoys. He refuses to recognise understands that a strong economy is absolutely necessary to pay for public services. Now, why have we made these decisions over the last decade that gets us to where we are now, where we can properly end austerity for good? Labour trashed the economy last time it was in power, like it always does. Let's just remember, the Shadow Chancellor talked about cuts that were made to public services over the last decade. Let's just remember what we inherited, the absolute mess that we inherited in 2010. A deficit, 10% of GDP, £150 billion in borrowing in that year, the biggest budget deficit in our peacetime history, the biggest budget deficit of any large industrialised nation. They were borrowing, Mr. Speaker, £5,000 a second. The deepest recession that we had seen in almost 100 years. And, Mr. Speaker, he talked about the bankers. Which government gave us the biggest banking bailout in global history? The last Labour government. That was our inheritance, Mr. Speaker. And it was absolutely clear that had that continued, that unsustainable rate of spending, with no link between what was coming in and what was going out, the country would have gone bankrupt, just like it did with Labour in the past when we had to go cap in hand to the IMF. That is the legacy of every Labour government. It took Conservatives to clear up Labour's mess, bringing the deficit under control, bringing debt under control, to have it falling for the first time in a generation in terms of proportion of national income, reducing taxes for 40 million people, backing millions of businesses, and a jobs miracle. More people employed today in Britain than at any other time in our history, the lowest unemployment rate since 1975. And the Shadow Chancellor talked about the impact on economic growth of our policies. Let me tell him about the impact on economic growth. Since 2010, since Conservatives were back in office, our economy has grown by 18.7%. That is faster than France, faster than Italy, faster than Japan. I'll tell him about the risk to the economy. The only risk to the economy is the Shadow Chancellor, his policies, and the entire party opposite. They have a tax hike, Mr. Speaker, for everyone. They have a tax hike if you happen to own a garden, if you want to give a gift to someone, if you want to go on holiday, if you own a home. Whoever you are, they've got a tax hike for you. They want to raid private pensions. Just this week we learned more about their plans. They want to confiscate 10% of almost all of our large companies. That's £300 billion they want to confiscate from pensioners from their private plans. Mr. Speaker, they also want to renationalise industry. Is it 7, 8, 9? I don't know how many industries they want to renationalise.
Order. Please resume your seat, Chancellor of the Exchequer. Thank you. I would just very gently point out that there is a difference, long understood and observed, between a debate in which there is a free play of arguments, ideas and commentary on policies, and a statement. Yeah. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer, with a little bit of encouragement from me, delivered a statement, and he has been questioned on the statement, and to the questions he's supposed to provide replies. It's not an occasion for a general political debate. No, I know exactly what the situation is, and I've got very much more experience of these matters than some of the people who think that they can criticise, so I do know what I'm doing. So the answer is, provide the answers to the question. Order! Provide the answers to the questions, and then other colleagues will have the opportunity to question the Chancellor. Requires just a little bit of versatility on one's feet. The Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say, I didn't detect many questions, so I'll finish very quickly, because I didn't give an opportunity for members to ask proper questions. The simple truth is, Mr. Speaker, Labour are unfit to govern. They would not deliver Brexit, they would wreck our economy over again, and hard-working families will pay the price, and we will not let it happen.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, may I genuinely welcome my right honourable friend to his appointment and congratulate him on it, and sincerely wish him every success in carrying out his extremely important duties. May I also welcome the many spending announcements he made, and in particular, let's single out further education, which successive governments have been trying to give better priority to for really the last 30 or 40 years. I hope it shows an effect. Could he reassure me that these announcements he's made are consistent with the fiscal rules that of his predecessors, that we're still subject to the same limits on the deficit that were then laid down, and he's still aiming to achieve year by year reductions in debt as a proportion of GDP. If you can give me those assurances, then it demonstrates what he's just said, that he's able to make these welcome announcements because austerity has been brought to an end by the achievements of his two predecessors over the last 9 years.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, can I welcome the warm words of my right honourable friend? And I still very much remember when he had this position and all the excellent work that he did, and I hope I can learn from how he performed his duties as Chancellor. He's asked me a specific question, Mr. Speaker, on fiscal rules. This spending round is within the current fiscal rules, and that does mean, with the forecast that we have, that we expect it to lead to meet both the sort of key rules of staying within 2% of GDP in terms of borrowing, and to see a further fall in debt as a proportion of GDP. But I would point him to some of the other comments I made in my speech a moment ago about looking again at the fiscal rules, particularly with an eye to taking advantage of record low interest rates and trying to invest more credibly in an infrastructure revolution.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Chancellor for advance sight of this statement. I have to say that the gimmicks and gems that the Chancellor has presented today are nothing more than an effort to distract us from the crippling crisis that this government is dragging us into. And, Mr. Speaker, if that was meant to be a pre-election budget, if I was a backbench Tory, I would be quaking in my boots. In less than 2 months, we could face a no-deal Brexit, unless that threat is removed by the House of Commons today, supporting the cross-party bill to secure an extension. Mr. Speaker, the threat cannot be underestimated. We're standing here facing increased uncertainty due to Brexit, meaning the outlook for our economy and for public finances remains extremely uncertain. The economy has already taken a hit, as we saw GDP contracting 0.2% in the second quarter of 2019. As Paul Johnson of the IFS put it in The Guardian, making big fiscal announcements in a period of great economic uncertainty means we will have little idea how sustainable or costly decisions made this week will be. The risks are exacerbated by not having up-to-date forecasts from the OBR. And while the Chancellor has announced increased spending today, this will not help end austerity. No. It will only pause some of the hardship in the short term. Meanwhile, Brexit will bring lasting and long-term damage to our economy and to our citizens' livelihoods. With the economy already faltering, the Chancellor's predecessor has warned that a disruptive no-deal Brexit could have a £90 billion hit on the Exchequer and suggested there will be no money available. Mr. Speaker, a no-deal Brexit would be devastating for Scotland, with the potential to destroy 100,000 Scottish jobs and cost every person the equivalent of £2,300 a year.
Let's talk about your jobs.
Brexit's already caused UK manufacturing activity to contract in August for the 4th consecutive month to the lowest level since 2012. According to the BBC, sterling fell below $1.20 on 3rd September, to its lowest since October 2016. The Chancellor pretends his government is putting people first, when in reality his government is putting the cult of the Leave campaigners and their Brexit obsession before the interests of the economy and before the interests of citizens. But yesterday in Scotland, Mr Speaker, the First Minister announced our programme of government, putting tackling climate change, protecting our economy and reducing inequality at the heart of our policy-making agenda. Here, we are talking about food and medicine shortages, talking about reducing opportunities for our young people and complete Brexit chaos. For the people of Scotland, this is a tale of two governments, and only the SNP Scottish Government is acting in our interests. The IFS is clear that pre-election bribes do not mean an end to austerity. The decade of austerity, which has cumulatively cut the Scottish Bloc grant by more than £12 billion in real terms, which has left people having to choose between heating their homes and feeding their children, and has reduced social security payments for disabled people 4 times faster than the cuts for others. If the Tories seriously wanted to make life better for their citizens, they would give Scotland its fair share. This means the Chancellor should repay the £140 million VAT owed to Police Scotland in refunds. Mr Speaker, we have been arguing for years for the convergence uplift monies to be returned. There are 50 mentions of the convergence uplift in Hansard, 45 of those from the SNP, and most of the others in response to SNP questions. So I am pleased that the pressure that we and our colleagues in the Scottish Government have brought on this government has come together. It also means Scotland must get its £3.4 billion share of the DUP's dirty deal Brexit fund. So, Mr Speaker, will the Chancellor rule out any new confidence and supply agreement with the DUP, giving them more money before we get the £3.4 billion that we are owed? Furthermore, it will appear that the Chancellor will overshoot his government's borrowing targets. Can he confirm whether this is the case? And can he tell the House now what borrowing rule changes he will bring in the budget? Can the Chancellor also guarantee that Scotland does not lose any of the EU funding that we currently receive? The UK Government must at the very least match the compensation scheme already put in place by the EU and Irish Government for the beef and suckler sectors in Ireland. And finally, Mr Speaker, the Government must scrap the proposed £30,000 salary limit on foreign nationals. Scottish Government analysis has found the average EU citizen in Scotland adds £10,400 to government revenue and £34,400 to GDP each year. The proposed £30,000 salary limit on foreign nationals to the UK has been shown to be unworkable and it should be scrapped. Mr Speaker, while the Tories balance the books on the backs of the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged, the SNP Scottish Government are leading the way to deliver a fairer Scotland.
Mr Speaker, first the Honourable Lady complains about the settlement with respect to Scotland. May I remind her that under the Barnett block-based block grant, that Scotland will see an increase of £1.2 billion in its spending power next year, and on top of that it will receive an additional £160 million for Scottish farmers, thanks to the representations of Scottish Tory MPs who seem to actually care about Scottish farmers. And despite that, she complains, and she talked about uncertainty, and so I would have thought she would welcome today's statement. This is, I think she referred to it as a budget. First, as a spending round, and it's a spending round that's focused only on spending, not taxes or capital investment, but it's designed to give certainty to all departments across government on funding for the next year, and without this they would not have that certainty. And she also talked about, she claimed that Brexit uncertainty is damaging the economy. Well, need I remind her that since the referendum we've had a record rate of growth in British businesses, we've had record growth in jobs, almost 1,000 new jobs created a day, with more people employed today than ever before, and we've had record inward investment. If she wants to end uncertainty, then she would support the spending round and make sure we leave the EU on the 31st of October.
So the extensive interest in the Chancellor's statement, but I remind the House that there is a 10-minute rule motion to follow and there are other important business that must come on stream absolutely no later than 3 o'clock. Therefore, there is a premium upon brevity from back and front benches alike, and I make the obvious point that lots of people who want to contribute will not today, realistically, have the opportunity to do so. Sir John Redwood.
Wokingham and West Berkshire councils do need money for social care and schools. Current funding is not adequate. I'm very grateful for the Chancellor. This is very welcome. Does he agree with me at a time of world slowdown led by a manufacturing recession in several leading countries? A boost to the economy is much needed here, and this is part of that boost.
Yes, I know, Mr. Speaker, that my right honourable friend speaks with great experience, and I very much agree that one of the outcomes of today's spending round, it will provide a further boost of confidence to our economy.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor is claiming that this is a boom in public spending, but I think all of us will know just how big the bust has been, and nowhere more than in DWP spending, which will see a real terms rise of 1.9%, which is welcome, Mr. Speaker. But can I ask the Chancellor, if you take into account increases in the state pension and population increases, will he commit within that budget to no further cuts to working age benefits?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady will know that this spending round covers day-to-day resource or departmental spending, and she will know that almost the vast majority of DW spending is not covered by day-to-day spending. And so when we later get to a budget, we can say much more about DWP spending. But she will also recognise that the way that the spending round will help today for those that are more vulnerable is by protecting our economy, make sure our economy continues to grow and continues to generate jobs, which is the best way out of poverty.
Sir Michael Fallon.
Welcome the increase in defence spending, which is well justified by the increase in threats that this country faces. When it comes to the fiscal rules, can my right honourable friend reassure the House that any revision of those rules will never make the government vulnerable to the kind of charges of fudged targets, reference periods and spending classifications that characterised the last Labour government?
Mr. Speaker, can I thank him for his support for the change and the increase in defence spending, and also I can give him that assurance that when the fiscal rules are looked at in time for the next budget, it will be done openly, transparently and clearly, and that is exactly what is needed to maintain market confidence.
Mr. Edward Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Chancellor to his place? But isn't it the case that head teachers, chief constables and NHS managers simply can't rely on the Chancellor's fancy figures if Britain crashes out of the EU?
Absolutely.
Mr. Speaker, the independent watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, said just 2 months ago that a no-deal Brexit would add £30 billion a year for the next 4 years to public borrowing. So what insurance has the Chancellor taken out against this massive risk to his spending plans? Isn't this just a con?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman should know that the government has no plans, as he puts it, to crash out the EU. Our plan is to get a deal, and if he wants us to help us to get the deal, then he should not vote for the surrender bill tonight.
Justine Greening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The real revolution that Britain needs is actually on social mobility and equality of opportunity. I welcome the investment announced today on schools, but can I encourage the Chancellor to revisit investment in children's services if he's really going to close the gap on opportunity? And can I also encourage him to look at reform close to home in his own department, because the Treasury simply isn't fit for purpose in understanding how to invest in Britain's biggest asset, which is its human capital, its people.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend speaks with great experience, and she's right to highlight the issues around children's services. And I would like to assure her that within these numbers today, she will see outside of the excellent investment in schools, there is investment across the board that would benefit children, particularly vulnerable children, particularly through social services. And I think she also makes a very good and valid point about the human capital and a need to look at that in a different way, and that's something I'm very interested in pursuing in the Treasury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If Dominic Cummings hadn't sacked his special advisor, he might have come up with a better speech. I noticed the Chancellor didn't mention the growth figures. Not surprising, given the economy is shrinking and every major sector of our economy, services, manufacturing, construction, are all struggling. Isn't it the case that whether it's the future of those industries or the spending plans he's laid out today, every single one of those promises is at risk from the no-deal recession that his government is pursuing with a reckless no-deal policy?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman claimed I didn't mention growth figures. Well, I did refer to growth. But first of all, there are no new growth figures today because there is no OBR forecast. But I did refer to growth. In fact, I pointed out the IMF forecast that we will grow faster this year than France, Italy and Japan. But again, he talks about the risk to the economy. The risk to the economy is the uncertainty of not leaving the EU, and we must leave by October the 31st. And if he wants to end that uncertainty, he knows what he's got to do tonight.
Kirsten Hare.
Mr. Speaker, I warmly welcome this spending review. £1.2 billion in extra funding for Scotland, another £160 million for our farmers, and I was delighted to see the increase in the spending within the MOD as well. And I would urge the SNP Scottish Government to spend on education, on health, on policing and on connectivity in my constituency. But does the Chancellor agree that what we should be doing, what the SNP should be doing, is welcoming this extra investment, which shows the strength of being part of our United Kingdom and removing the threat of independence, which would unleash the economy in Scotland?
Mr. Speaker, I wholeheartedly agree with my honourable friend. Can I take this opportunity to thank her for helping me to focus on this issue around Scottish farmers, her and our colleagues on this side of the House, and that has helped secure this £160 million. But she's also right, the extra £1.2 billion Scotland will get, it's a huge amount, it's a record amount, but with the SNP, one thing unfortunately we can be sure of is that they will waste it.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, despite the best efforts of some members on this side to talk the economy down, I'm glad that the Chancellor has been able to make these announcements today, and I welcome the £400 million for Northern Ireland, which will help to recruit police officers, to reduce waiting lists and to give some relief to school budgets. But does he recognise that if he's going to realise his goal of levelling growth across the United Kingdom, there is still much more that needs to be done to ensure that resources are sent to places like Northern Ireland and other regions of the United Kingdom in order to make sure that growth is experienced equally across the United Kingdom?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is making a very important point, and can I thank him for first of all the welcome of the extra £400 million for Northern Ireland, but also about levelling up growth across the country. I referred a number of times to my statement earlier about making sure we have that growth in every part of our great UK, and that includes, for example, with infrastructure investment, and I hope that when I set out the infrastructure strategy later this year, he will welcome it for those reasons.
So it's outrage.
Mr. Richard Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, can the Chancellor tell us when we can expect an announcement on funding for service plots of land?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, can I first take this opportunity to thank my honourable friend for all the work that he has done on self-build homes and generally in promoting easier access to homes for everyone. And that is something that we are discussing with MHCLG, and I will take it up further and I will get back to him.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm surprised that the Chancellor has the cheek to call this a spending review because, frankly, it is nothing of the sort. And it's no surprise that the Office for Budget Responsibility did not dignify this with its own economic and fiscal analysis, which is normal with a spending review. The Chancellor said when he made his 3-year commitment for school spending that he recognises the importance of schools being able to plan. So can I ask the Chancellor, should local governments be able to plan for the future when investing in social care, in youth services and tackling homelessness? And if he does think that they should be able to prepare and plan for the future, why did they not get a 3-year settlement as well?
Councillor.
Mr. Speaker, can I first of all just say gently to the Honourable Lady, this is a spending round. I haven't referred to it as a spending review. She may know that a spending review normally is a number of years, and this is one single year. She also then said that I think her words are, I didn't dignify it with an OBR forecast. Well, no spending review or spending round comes with an OBR forecast. That's normally done at a budget, and there's 2 forecasts a year. And I thought she may know that, but I'm happy to let her know. Then she also talked about funding in certain areas, whether it's social care, in youth services, and I have referred to those. I've set out plans for next year, but also plans for the future, for example, with the new Youth Investment Fund.
John Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor clearly recognises the importance of growing the economy, because a growing economy is how we afford public services. To help achieve growth, particularly in the north, I understand there have been certain discussions about the possible creation of free ports in the north of England. Carlisle Lake District Airport, owned by Stobbarts, commenced its commercial flights recently, and they have ambition to create an airport free port. Is that something the Chancellor would support?
Mr. Speaker, I'd be very happy to take a look at that proposal. My honourable friend will know already we have accelerated our work generally on free ports, and that work's being led by the Trade Secretary and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, but I'd be very happy to look at an airport free port proposal.
Yes. Chris Brown.
Instead of wasting £4 billion on no deal, can he just spend some money in the Rhondda, please? Just 2% of that figure would pay for finishing off the Rhondda-Vach Relief Road, rebuilding Llyn-y-Forwyn School, buying new trains which might actually be clean and run on time for the Treherbert line, providing a new home for the Rhondda Sea Cadets, and paying for a new PET-CT scanner for South Wales.
Councillor.
Mr. Speaker, well, the good news is we don't have to choose between investing in leaving the EU and investing in Rhondda or anywhere else in the country. And the reason is because under the Conservatives, you'll have a strong economy, but if that party was ever in charge, then we wouldn't have the money to invest anywhere.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Chancellor for his statement and particularly the focus on rebuilding our infrastructure? And of course, he is right to ensure that it delivers value for money. Can I therefore ask that he has another look at the Lower Thames crossing to ensure that it is delivering value for money, and also that it delivers its primary aim of relieving congestion at the existing Dartford crossing?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, the general point my honourable friend makes about infrastructure, about value for money, he is, of course, absolutely right. And as we spend more on infrastructure, we've got to make sure that principle is always maintained. And he's invited me to take a further look at the Lower Thames crossing. I would be happy to do that, and I'd also be happy to discuss it with him.
Caroline Lucas.
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor tells us that the challenge of decarbonisation is real, as if he's only just discovered it. But we face a climate emergency, so why haven't we had a spending round that would actually match that climate emergency? Green groups are urging him to commit at least 2% of GDP on immediate climate action. Is he going to do it, or is it just going to pile up with all of his other broken promises?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, can I say to the Honourable Lady, in this spending round, because, again, if I may point out, it is focused on day-to-day resource spending. She may know, so, for example, some very important investments that will need to be made in decarbonisation will be capital investments, and that's just not covered today. But it doesn't mean to say it's not going to happen, it's not taken seriously. But one step that we have taken today is provide more funding to BEIS to work with the Treasury on the decarbonisation plan to meet the net 2050 targets, and that there's an additional funding of £30 million to work on that programme. And there are also other measures I announced today that would help. So, for example, the £200 million on buses, which will be low, and ultra low emission buses, and I hope she would welcome that too.
Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Chancellor to his position. Blaby District Council and Harborough District Council, both in my South Leicestershire constituency, would greatly welcome a meeting, the leaders of Conservative-led councils, with the local government finance minister. Would the Chancellor help to organise that so that the minister can discuss the additional funds that the Chancellor has announced today?
Mr. Speaker, I will gladly help my honourable friend to organise such a meeting, and I will certainly speak to ministers in the relevant department.
Yvette Cooper.
The Chancellor will know the Home Affairs Select Committee has called for a long time for substantial additional resources for policing, and this is important. So can he confirm that the £750 million he refers to is a real terms increase and is all central government funding, as he will know that central government funding for policing has been cut by £3 billion since 2010? Can he also confirm this is not yet enough to fund the restoration of over 20,000 police officers that have been cut since 2010, and that it also does not reverse any of the cuts of 7,000 PCSOs and 5,000 specials since 2010?
Chancellor.
What I can confirm to the right honourable lady, and I hope she finds it helpful, is that for the Home Office, what I did, my starting point was to roll over all funding on real terms that the Home Office had received in this year. And so that was the baseline, which hadn't been done before. And secondly, I added to that the extra costs that were required, the major cost being for the extra officers. So what I can tell her is that the real terms increase in the Home Office budget is £800 million. That's an increase in real terms growth rate of 6.3%, and that is the biggest increase in real terms in the Home Office budget in 15 years.
Sir Edward Lee.
As we saw on the PAC during the Labour years, invariably, if there are rapid increases in public spending, particularly on health, they are accompanied by increasing levels of unproductivity. So how is the Chancellor going to maintain his laser-like focus on economy and efficiency and ensure that more and more of our spending is not sucked into administration or a proportion away from the front line? In other words, tax and spend on its own doesn't work.
Mr. Speaker, it's a very important point my right honourable friend makes, and he's talked about it in the context of health, but you could apply that to many other departments. But he's absolutely right that as we allocate this new spending, especially if it's multi-year funding in the billions, that it is imperative that we make sure every penny is spent wisely, and that is work that's jointly done with the department, but also a unit in the Treasury, and we will have a laser-like focus on efficiency, and if we need to take action, we won't hesitate.
Frank Field.
The Chancellor didn't mention those families who are today hungry and facing destitution. Those families have suffered £1,200 cuts in benefits. What message would he like to send to them today?
I'd say to the, if I may speak, to the right honourable gentleman, two things on that. First, that again, just similar to a previous question I answered, that when it comes to welfare and DWP, that this settlement today only covers the resource day-to-day spending. As he'll know, most spending in terms of benefits is not resource day-to-day spending. But secondly, in answering his question, he said, how will it help people in such vulnerable positions? What this does today is it underlines the fundamental economic strength, and that will give more confidence, and this means that our economy can continue to grow, continue to generate jobs, and jobs will continue always to be the best sustainable way out of poverty.
Luke Graham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to welcome the Chancellor's statement, including the £1.2 billion extra that will be coming to Scotland, which is an increase on the real terms increase we already received in the budget last year. Can I especially thank him for the £160 million that will be coming back in rural funding to our constituency, something demanded by NFU Scotland, something requested by my constituents, and is delivered by the Scottish Conservatives with his help.
Mr. Speaker, well, my honourable friend is right on every account. It has been delivered by Scottish Conservatives, and can I take this opportunity to thank him for all the representations that he made to me, along with his colleagues, and how he has achieved this result. It just shows you that Scottish Conservatives really care about their constituents, unlike the SNP.
Dr Sarah Wollaston.
This morning I met with NHS Trust leaders from around the country. They painted an absolutely shocking picture of infrastructure that's crumbling, unsafe and broken. They welcome the unfreezing of £1 billion so that they can get on and fix some of it, but it doesn't go far enough. There's a £6 billion backlog. And what they're asking for is for us to reach the levels of comparable countries in spending on NHS infrastructure. Will the Chancellor meet with me to discuss their very serious concerns and the measures that we need to take to move this forward?
Yes, it does actually. Mr. Speaker, can I first thank the Honourable Lady for welcoming one of the changes I made a few weeks ago, which was to unlock or bring forward £1 billion of capital investment, new capital investment in our hospitals, and on top of that an additional fresh £850 million to upgrade 20 hospitals. But she makes an important point, and again she'll know that today is about day-to-day resource spending. She's talking about another important area, which is capital, and I'll make sure that she gets the meeting with ministers that she wants.
Sarah Newton.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome this additional investment in our vital public services. The Britain's Leading Edge report that I helped launch in July evidenced an historic bias in the funding of our public services in England's regions with major cities. So will my right honourable friend use the spending review to end this bias so regions like Cornwall can play their full part in the Treasury's economic renewal plans?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, I very much agree with my honourable friend, and she's made this point powerfully. She's done it on a number of occasions. In the past one, for example, we've talked about police funding and making sure that reflects local need. And she will hopefully have noticed it in my remarks today. I've talked a lot about levelling up across the country, whether it's the infrastructure investment or investment in public services. And I can give her an assurance that Cornwall will not be left behind.
Siva Malhotra.
I look forward to sharing plans of the Southern Rail access to Heathrow, which I hope will form an important part of his new, the Chancellor's new infrastructure strategy. But this month, Mr. Speaker, Hounslow CCG was due to present the full business case for the planned and urgently needed Heston Health Centre redevelopment to their governing body. The project is on hold now after questions about whether the LIFT scheme, which was originally advised by the Department for Health as the best value funding option, can still go ahead following confusion around his department's policy on lift schemes from last year. Will he meet with me to review this situation and whether existing plans can be approved, or whether any alternative capital funding he's announced will be available so this important and urgent development can go ahead?
Mr. Speaker, I will happily discuss with officials the issue the Honourable Lady has raised, and I'm sure they will be happy to meet with her.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Chancellor for the extra money to local government and social care, which for East Sussex will prove hugely impactful. But can I make particular reference to the school spending increases? The increase to £5,000 for secondary and £4,000 next year for primary will help East Sussex schools lift and almost catch up some of their more wealthier parts of the country. And in doing that, can I thank the teachers and head teachers and governors who have fought their campaign with me with respect, reason, but with absolute passion to deliver the best for their school children.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to take this opportunity to thank my honourable friend for the campaign, but the way that he's worked with the Treasury and I know with DFE on this. I think he's referring to the F40 campaign, one that I'm very familiar of as a constituency MP, and I'm pleased that we've been able to make this huge shift, step change in school funding, and I know it's been welcomed across the country.
Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After all those announcements over the summer, I had hoped for more detail today, but if the Chancellor and the Department has a laser-like focus, rest assured the Public Accounts Committee will be delving through these figures and holding him to account. But, Mr. Speaker, as others have said, the Chancellor has indicated he's going to change the fiscal rules. We already have 85% ratio of debt to GDP. Can he advise us what's the tolerance level that he would go up to in terms of that debt level in the future? And is he considering increases in taxation?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I welcome scrutiny from her committee. It's a very, very important committee. She may not have had enough time yet, but there's a lot of detail in this book that's been published alongside my statement today. She referred to debt to GDP. I think she said it's 85%. I think the last OBR forecast from March had it 82.2%, and on their last forecast on a declining trajectory. But in terms of changes to the fiscal rules, obviously I've set out that I am looking at the fiscal rules, and in time for budget there may well be changes, but I won't want to set out what those are today because we haven't decided.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Chancellor and his statement? Does the spending round contain any provision for the establishment of a UK Development and Investment Bank, which I believe will be an extremely strong vehicle to make the kinds of investments that he talks about, both in the public sector and in the private sector, and indeed internationally?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell my honourable friend that in today's statement, because it doesn't focus on capital, and I think the kind of suggestion that he has just mentioned would be certainly a capital investment if it happened. But I know that he's spoken with my honourable friend, the Economic Secretary, and we are happy to have further discussions.
Louise Ellman.
Mr. Speaker, the people of Liverpool have suffered 64% horrific cuts in funding for local services, and I was pleased to hear the Chancellor state this afternoon that no department will be cut next year. Is that an absolute guarantee that Liverpool City Council will not have any reduction in real terms for its funding for local services next year? And when will he make the money available to complete the new Royal Liverpool Hospital?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady will know that when it comes to local council funding, there will be a combination of grant funding and locally raised funding. And so it's hard to say what might happen specifically to any particular council's funding, because it depends a large part on what they choose to do as well. What I can tell her that hopefully will give her some reassurance is that from the announcement today, next year, the core funding for local government across England will receive its highest increase in a decade.
Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the North, there are 42,000 more people in work than there were a year ago, and 280 businesses being supported through the Northern Powerhouse £400 million investment fund. So I welcome the Chancellor's announcement of the infrastructure revolution and indeed the acceleration of HS3 Northern Powerhouse rail. Will my honourable friend make sure that throughout the next year that the Northern Powerhouse is kept at the heart of government's thinking in terms of the economy and what we can do in the North to close that productivity gap and really deliver for the country?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can absolutely give that guarantee to my honourable friend. And first of all, can I congratulate her on the excellent work that she's done locally to bring this to the attention of the Treasury, especially when it comes to infrastructure investment in the North. She's done a fantastic job, and I would be very happy to listen to her ideas on this, especially when it comes to infrastructure, and be very happy to meet with her.
Order. I'm sorry to disappoint remaining colleagues, a point of which I did give notice at an earlier stage. I should just as a courtesy advise the House that it was the terms of the order of the House of yesterday which require me to stick to time and to move on to next business, and I'm genuinely sorry to colleagues who were disappointed. We come now to the 10-minute rule motion. Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to grant local authorities increased powers of compulsory purchase, to amend the law relating to land valuation and compensation, to make provision requiring landowners to fulfil conditions relating to planning permission and for connected purposes. Mr Speaker, it will be of no surprise to you or any member that I begin this speech by extolling Hull's virtues. Hull is a growing, successful city that is attracting significant investment and undergoing really positive change. The Council has already granted numerous housing, commercial, industrial and educational permissions, the majority of which have been implemented and are taking other vital steps to secure our future. Those members present in my Westminster Hall debate yesterday will have heard me talk about one such step, Hull's bid to become Yorkshire's maritime city.